debates about how we are to understand who Christ is. Indeed, for many centuries in the church, this had to be slowly articulated and figured out. Jesus did many things here in his earthly ministry, but not all of it was totally comprehensible at the time. It takes many years to grow in our understanding of what exactly Jesus did and what he accomplished for us. And so we know that really the first major discussion was whether or not Jesus really was fully God and whether or not he really was fully man. And we know that was solved at the Council of Nicaea. But then there was also the question of, well, okay, but how many natures does he have? And how many persons does he have? If he's truly human and God, does that mean he's both a human person and also a divine person? Or is he just one person? And then there's the question of, well, if he's one person, which we all believe, I hope, he's one person, two natures, then how many wills does he have? For all you and I as people, we only have one will. And it's a great marker of what it means to be a person. So there's this question of, how many wills does Jesus have? It's called the heresy of the monothelite heresy, which is meaning one will. So the reality is Jesus actually has two wills. Just as he has two natures, he has two intellects and also two wills. And yet he is only one person. He's not a human person. He's a divine person who assumed human nature, a human nature to himself. Human nature composed of intellect, will, emotions, etc. It's a little bit confusing. Some of you here were part of my classes we went through last fall. We talked about this one evening. We talked about what it means to say that Jesus is one person and two natures. It was kind of confusing. I think the Hiddles were there. Where the Hiddles at? Yeah, so it's interesting. So I think a great way to describe it, Archbishop Fulton Sheen, he gave a great analogy when we talk about who exactly Jesus is, right? So we say that he's not a human person. He's only human nature, consisting of human intellect and human will. In themselves, they were useless because there was no consciousness, no personhood attached to them. So Archbishop Fulton Sheen says that Jesus' human nature is like a marker, which in itself can't do anything. And Jesus, in his divine nature, which you might say is the human hand, reaches down with the marker, and the person of Jesus begins to write on the marker board, with the human nature as the marker, the divine nature as his hand. And yet we don't say the marker writes or that the hand writes. We say I write or you write, meaning the person. Jesus is this one person, this one act of consciousness, using both a human nature and a divine nature. Now, this might seem highfalutin, and it is a little bit, but I think it's helpful. I think I had a theology professor once, he said the whole purpose of studying theology, the whole purpose of understanding Christology, the study of Jesus, is so that when we come to places like Gethsemane, or when we come on Good Friday and we venerate the cross, we know exactly who it is that we are worshiping. Because if you get certain aspects of this wrong, you're thinking of a different person, of a different being. It all comes to a head at the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus, in his human nature, expresses his fear, his anxiety, you might even say despair, and yet in his divine nature, in his divine will, assents to the will of the Father. But you see, Jesus isn't just a human person, a divine person, he's one person. And so in his person, in his human nature, he assents to the will of the Father. What you and I would never be able to do on our own, he does for us. His human nature, his human will, on behalf of all of humanity, assents to the will of the Father in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's beautiful. I have a really good friend I met a few years ago, and she used to be a Protestant. She was Methodist, and she said one of her favorite parts about being a Catholic is that her suffering in life is no longer useless. It's no longer meaningless. It can be redeemed. It can be transformed and utilized. And Jesus was the first person who did that for us, redeeming his own suffering, his own anxiety. In life, I want to pray for courage in our suffering. I think it's helpful to think about this image of Jesus in the garden. That courage is not having no fear. It's not desiring to do something that is dangerous or painful, but rather it's seeing all of the pain, seeing all the suffering, and yet choosing it anyway for the good of others, for the good of God, for the good of ourselves. So when we ask God for that courage to accept our suffering willingly, that he might make our suffering redemptive in this life, so that we might participate in his own redemption.